The Arizona Legislature's main constitutional duty is to prepare and pass a state budget. How's that coming along 82 days into the current session?
Budget negotiations this year, I think it's fair to say they've been slow, and that's no surprise. This is my 9th year in the legislature, and what I've found is that every year has a different rhythm to it.
From my perspective, there's nothing going on with budget negotiations, and that's fairly disturbing. It's already a couple days into April, and we haven't heard even an inkling that there's any talk of a budget.
Lack of action on the budget, is it a sign of the governor's gumption or legislative lethargy? We went to the state capitol to find out. It's Arizona Week.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.
Once again, your moderator, Michael Chiha.
Governor Jan Brewer has her heels dug in to get Medicaid expansion, and that's keeping the legislature from drawing up and passing a state budget. We spoke to several people involved in the process and 2 veteran journalists to find out how it's going. First, the governor's budget director, John Arnold. What's the status of the negotiations over the budget with the state legislature?
Well, every year the governor comes out with a budget recommendation. We did that in January. The legislature takes that recommendation, mulls over it, and then we usually start chatting in late January, February, and those discussions go on as long as they need to. And so we're in about the same place we are in every other year. We've been chatting and exchanging information and ideas and coming to some resolution on some of the items.
Is it still at the staff level? There's not principals involved in the conversations yet?
You know, the governor meets with leadership all the time, with the Senate president and the speaker, and we talk to other members of the legislature all the time. And so, while the informational discussions are often at the staff level, members and especially legislative leadership are constantly involved. So that's.
What is the area of agreement that you referred to? Where are you finding agreement?
You know, we usually start with the broad overarching pieces of the state budget, the caseload issues and revenues, and you know how much money the state has, and how many students are we going to have to take care of this year? What does university growth look like? So we're going through all of that. And then we get into the policy issues, and we're having pretty good discussions on those as well.
What areas would you say are going to be contentious, or perhaps are already contentious?
Well, the governor came out with a number of key policy initiatives in her budget proposal, probably the most controversial of which is Medicaid expansion. And that's been subject of some long and discussions, and we continue to have those discussions. In addition to that, the governor proposed a comprehensive K-12 performance incentive package that ties K-12 funding for our schools to how well those schools perform. And that's a new idea that has been out there for a time, never fully implemented, and we would be one of the first in the country to really do something like that. And so that's been going through the legislative process, a lot of discussions about that K-12 program, and you know, those discussions are ongoing.
The Medicaid expansion has implications for revenues in the state. First of all, a flow of money from the federal government, but also an assessment against the hospital and the healthcare industry that would bring money into the state coffers. But is it being pursued distinct from the budget or adjunct to it?
Yeah, a little of both. The Medicaid expansion is one of the largest issues to hit the state in really the last 30 years. It has huge ramifications on the state economy, on individuals in our state, hundreds of thousands of individuals, and how we provide health care for those individuals, on our hospital system and our broader health care system. It's a very large issue, and in that sense, it's being discussed and handled both outside of the budget as a unique discussion point and inside the budget because of the revenue and expenditure implications from Medicaid expansion. So we really can't set the rest of the budget until we understand what we're doing on Medicaid because its impact is so significant on the budget.
We're hearing that there is agreement with legislators and the governor about the notion of increased funding for K-12 for education in general. It's the details that need to be worked out now in regard to that?
That's correct. There's, I think, broad interest from the legislature and in the governor's office to provide funding for the K-12 system. They did take some significant reductions when we were in recession, and the state we're in a better spot than we were 2-3 years ago. And we would like to see some investments in the K-12 system. And so we're working through that process. But yeah, there will be a K-12 package. How significant and exactly where we're at is still being worked out.
Back to Medicaid for a minute.
Sure.
Is the governor planning to use that, from your perspective, as any kind of leverage, or use the budget as leverage to get what she wants on Medicaid? Because she's pretty much gone all out and put a lot of energy into pursuing the Medicaid expansion.
The Medicaid expansion was a very, very tough decision for the governor. It's not, the idea of expanding an entitlement inside the state is not really what she's been about. But as we sat down and went through the numbers and the logic behind the expansion and the circumstances that we're in, the specific circumstances of Arizona, it became very clear that it was the right thing to do. And once the governor makes a decision, she usually goes pretty aggressively to implement those decisions. We saw that when she decided that the state needed a temporary sales tax. She aggressively pursued that, and ultimately we got that done, and I think she will aggressively pursue Medicaid expansion until it's done.
Republican legislative leaders acknowledge the budget process is going slowly, but say they're seeing some movement. Update us, please, on where the budget negotiations are.
Okay. Budget negotiations this year, I think it's fair to say they've been slow, and that's no surprise. This is my 9th year in the legislature, and what I've found is that every year has a different rhythm to it. I don't know why that is, but I know it is. And part of the reason is you have every 2 years you have a different legislature, and this year we have quite a few new people in the House, and I think that has added to things a little bit in terms of the budget being slowed down. There are many other reasons, but I think that's a part of it.
We're in the process of looking at a legislative alternative to the governor. We've been talking with members, getting their input. As you probably know, the governor had come up with a budget and presented that to us. And so we've had a time now to look at that, talk with our members, and kind of evaluate what's our view, what's important to some of our members, and then look at an alternative.
What are you seeing in the governor's proposal that you can agree with at this point?
Well, I think we've already shown the CPS needs more money. We've made allocation already for that.
Child Protective Services.
So I think that will be an area that will have increased funding. Education will be another area that will have increased funding. So those are a couple of the key areas.
The budget negotiations generally go on first between the legislative staffs and the governor's staff. Yes. And then they move to legislative leadership and the governor herself or her chief of staff.
Right.
Where are they right now?
Okay. Right now there's a conversation going on a regular basis between the staffs, legislative staff, governor's staff, some conversation between House and Senate leadership and the governor, and just recently in the Senate and now in the House, we've had some small group meetings with our caucuses and kind of updating them on where things are. So there is movement. We are moving. It's just that we're not quite as advanced as we have been in the last couple of years.
What would you say the major areas of agreement are at this point between you all and the governor?
Yeah. Well, we agree on, I think probably one of the major areas of importance of agreement is that we both agree that we need to put more money in the CPS, Child Protective Services, and that we need to put more money in K-12 education. And that's I think that's very important, and that's one of the major areas of agreement. And then there's so many small areas that we agree on, that we really agree on much more than what we disagree.
And what are the areas of contention? Have you identified those so far?
Well, obviously the Medicaid expansion is the biggest hurdle. We've got members on both sides of that continuum, some that are very supportive and some that are very opposed.
And do you see Medicaid being tied closely to the budget? Will it be pursued distinct from the budget?
Well, as the governor presented it, it's an intricate part because with the hospital assessments, it actually draws down not only enough to cover those assessments, but to actually free up money from our general fund. So we'll have, in essence, a relief on the general fund because money will be coming out of that. So what we do with that, again, will be determined by whether or not we have that assessment. So it's an intricate part.
It has an effect in two ways. One, the Medicaid expansion itself, if you agree with Governor Brewer and that we should go ahead and do the Medicaid expansion, then it actually saves $100 million in our budget. So that's $100 million is a big item. We have a $9 billion budget. $100 million doesn't seem like much, but how much we have to play with and where our variances are, $100 million is a lot. So that's a big issue. And then also the energy that's being spent right now on working through the Medicaid expansion issue, you know, just what are we going to do? Are we going to expand? There's those on both sides of that issue. So it's not only the impact it has on the budget itself, but the fact that that's an issue that needs to be resolved. And it'll be resolved around the budget, and I think when that gets resolved, then we'll see very fast movement on getting a budget that the Republican leadership and in the legislature and the governor agree on.
And the energy that you talked about that's going into that Medicaid discussion includes a lot of political energy, and especially
absolutely.
On the governor's side, she's
Yes.
put she has a lot at stake in this. Her aides have described her as having her heels dug in over it.
Yes.
Is she going to leverage that against the budget?
Well, sure. I don't know that I'd use the word leverage, but I'm sure that plays a role because that's something that's important to her. And I know that'll play a role when we come to negotiating and trying to bridge those gaps.
Will that be a long, contentious fight?
Well, hopefully not. We're not projecting any early solutions. Obviously, our discussions, we're assuming that we'll be here till June.
Democrats, as usual, are left to watch from the sidelines, although they are seeing some chance to have influence in line with the governor. What are you hearing about what's going on with negotiations for the state budget?
Well, I think the emphasis needs to be on the word hearing. Democrats, again, are not involved. My understanding is that both the president and the speaker met with the governor, that they're talking about revenue numbers, which is the first thing they need to agree on. In terms of their priorities, I understand that they were to take 5 priorities each to the governor. Don't know if they had the same 5 priorities, if there were 10 different ones or what, that sort of thing. So I think we're really in the preliminary stages right now. Of course, the big elephant in the room is Medicaid expansion. The president has said he will allow a vote on it, but he is definitely opposed to the Medicaid expansion. The speaker wants to tweak it, wants to put his thumbprint on the Medicaid expansion. So be interesting to see where we go with this.
From my perspective, there's nothing going on with budget negotiations, and that's fairly disturbing. It's already a couple days into April, and we haven't heard even an inkling that there's any talk of a budget. And it really shows that there is no leadership among the Republicans right now to get a budget for the state.
House Democrats produced a budget proposal this year. Tell us a little about that.
Well, our budget's very reflective of the needs of the middle-class families and working families of Arizona. It puts investments in certain areas, specifically healthcare, education, and school safety, actually, something that we've all talked about, but very few people have actually, tried to figure out how to bring that, as well as something else that we've neglected for many years, which is the mental health illness investments, particularly making sure that we identify our seriously mentally ill community and try to get them help. We also do some very important investments that align with the governor's budget. We did meet with the governor. Our budget is not exactly like hers, but we ended up being pretty close to hers. We had a very good conversation with the governor where she went through her priorities. We've been speaking to her about our priorities. And one of the areas that we've all agreed on is the need for a huge investment when it comes to the Common Core standards, because we have to start educating our educators to get our kids ready for Common Core.
I know that the Democratic caucus priorities here in the Senate are certainly to make sure we do something about Child Protective Services funding. We'd like to see money for prevention in that funding. If we just keep putting money into caseworkers, we're going to see a continued increase in the number of children in out-of-home care. We've got to do something at the front end and keep the kids from coming into the system. We want to make sure, of course, that we have funding for the Common Core, the cost of living adjustment for schools, so K-12 education, the universities is of course very important to us as well.
You mentioned the Medicaid being a big sticking point, or the possibility of being a big sticking point, and the Democratic caucus is pretty united in support of that Medicaid expansion. Do you see the governor using the budget as leverage to get that for herself or for the state?
Yeah, well, yeah, Democrats, you're exactly right. Democrats are fully supportive of Medicaid expansion, and that is the one thing we really have to get done this session. I think the governor will use every tool at her disposal in order to make sure that Medicaid expansion happens. Last week, Senator Landrum Taylor, our Democratic caucus leader, and I met one-on-one with the governor. Actually, I guess two-on-one, and she said she has no vacation plans, she has no children to take to Disneyland, that she's ready to wait it out. She hasn't used her veto stamp at this point, but if she needs to, she will. It's full of ink, so she's ready to be here for the long haul. We've seen her in the past. When she wants something done, it happens.
And now a conversation with two veteran legislative reporters who can tell us what might be going on with the budget or what might not be going on with the budget. Joining me are Mary Jo Pitzel of the Arizona Republic and Luigi Del Puerto of the Arizona Capital Times. Thanks for being with me today.
Nice to see you, Michael.
Mary Jo, you wrote this week about the budget process or the slowness in the budget process. What is going on with it?
Well, currently work on the fiscal 2014 budget is happening behind doors. It's largely still happening on a staff level, meaning that staffers for the Republican majority in the legislature and for Governor Brewer are sitting down talking about basic concepts. And once a week, the governor meets with President Biggs and House Speaker Andy Tobin to talk about an array of topics. And I suspect that budget is starting to nudge up there towards the top.
Luigi, is it late for this to be happening? Everybody seems to be saying that, but is it really?
Well, to a certain extent, it is late. It is already April, and typically lawmakers by this point would have a counter offer to the governor, and typically at this point also you would have a more aggressive budget talks, and not just staff to staff level conversations, but lawmakers having discussions among themselves and offering some ideas about how to counter the governor's offer. You would be seeing typically at this point that level of a discussion, beginning of April, and we're not seeing that yet.
And Mary Jo, why is that?
Medicaid. There's this little thing that the governor proposed at the beginning of the year called Let's Expand Medicaid, and that has not gone over well with the Republican majority. And Medicaid, you can argue, can be done as a separate bill. That has not happened yet, but it's very intertwined with the budget because it has financial implications. And if the governor doesn't get her Medicaid expansion, she could veto the budget. You don't want to have the budget vetoed and get into a stalemate like we saw 4 years ago where they dragged on for a year fighting over the budget. That time it was the sales tax. So it's Medicaid that's really the biggest holdup.
And Luigi, from your perspective, give us a little more detail on that. I assume you agree that that's the hang-up.
Yeah, precisely. That's the elephant in the room, and typically the problem with or the concern with the fiscal side of Medicaid is that the governor's budget proposal, which he unveiled at the beginning of this year, essentially assumes that we would be getting additional money from the feds that we can put into the general fund. And use it for other programs, for example, public safety, education. I think she's assuming about $150 million or so at the very least that we would be getting in fiscal year 14 that would be available to us as a result of expanding Medicaid. And so $150 million or so, that's a big piece. And not only that, I mean, the Medicaid expansion really, it's the one thing that is driving the conversation right now. Everything else is subsumed, even though, as you know, it's drafting the budget is their only constitutional duty. And they're not able to do that unless they get some sort of a resolution or some way forward with Medicaid.
And Mary Jo, the governor's budget director, John Arnold, told us that she will dig in her heels on Medicaid and she'll get what she wants in that regard. Do you see that happening?
I would not be surprised at all because of what we saw in 2009. Remember, Governor Brewer came into office after Napolitano left to join the Obama administration. And Jan Brewer had been governor less than a month when she stood up and said, we need to raise taxes. You know, and the Republicans all fainted and said, no way. You know, tax increases are anathema to a lot of them. It took her a year of fighting and vetoing and prolonged sessions, but she won. She finally got a vote out of this legislature to put a sales tax measure on the ballot. So if history is any guide, the governor proved to be a very persistent combatant on that, and she got her way.
Well, and interestingly, Luigi, the Medicaid expansion proposal includes what some Republicans in the legislature are calling a tax increase. Is it deja vu here?
Well, I think there's some concern about semantics. The governor's office is calling it a provider assessment. Essentially, it's a tax on the hospitals. We are going to tax the hospital's revenues in order to use that money and draw down federal funds. So in a way, it is a tax. The problem is that the governor's proposal essentially relegates that authority to the director of access. And the heartburn that creates is that many Republican lawmakers are saying, well, that just grabs our power to appropriate funds away from us and gives it to a head of an agency. And they're saying, well, we can't really sit well with that.
But that's the only way they're going to get an assessment on hospitals or a tax increase on hospitals is if you let that authority happen with the director of access. The legislature is not going to pass a tax increase. And there will be, and behind the scenes and increasingly out in public, there is going to be a very robust debate about whether this hospital assessment is a tax. If it is a tax, it would require a 2/3 vote of the legislature, which is a real hard pull to achieve. If it's simply a simple majority, in a technical sense, the governor has those votes today. Not that she's willing to call the question.
Well, in that regard, Luigi, would she still hold up the budget to get what she wants on Medicaid? In other words, force the 2/3 vote?
At this point, we are not really seeing how the governor is planning or what the governor's strategy is in order to get her proposal out of the legislature. What we know is that she has a very big stick, or I should say several big sticks, and that includes the veto stamp. She hasn't quite taken out her veto stamp yet, but she is starting to indicate that if she does not get what she wants, she might. As you know, the governor a few weeks ago had said, I want you guys to slow down on sending bills to my desk. And it's not a threat, not yet anyway. In addition to that, the governor can wait. She can sit it out. She can wait until December, which she did a couple of years ago, and let's call that her long-term hammer.
Yes. So in addition to having a big stick, she also has tall heels, and she can dig those heels in. And again, as I said earlier, I think that she has shown that she's very willing to do so. And this Medicaid expansion is a big issue for her.
Now, Mary Jo, in the last couple of years, when it came to budget negotiations, the governor got a little bit of what she wanted, but the legislature seems to have gotten more. less funding for education than the governor was pursuing, perhaps less funding for some other areas the governor was pursuing. Is there any portent in that for what might happen this year?
Well, just yesterday, earlier this week, President Biggs said that education is going to see the biggest increase it's seen in years. Now, granted, education hasn't had much of an increase, in some years, nothing. So how significant that is, but it will be a positive, and it'll be a big chunk of change, he assures, although we have not seen any kind of figures. That would fit with the governor. The question is, the big question on education funding is there's $82 million in inflation funding, which the state has not been paying to the schools for the last 3 years. A court has said, got to do that. The legislature is appealing that to the state Supreme Court, and we don't know yet if the court will take that up. So the question is, do you build that inflation funding in to the education budget, and then on top of that, do you put in all the other increases that especially the governor is seeking for compliance with new academic standards?
Luigi, could the legislature pass a budget without the inflation factor for education and then perhaps be called back into special session if there's a ruling that they have to do that?
I mean, that's very likely to happen. I think the indication is that they're looking very closely at this funding that they need to put into the budget. I think there's an understanding that if the court said, yes, you need to fund this one, so assuming the Supreme Court take this up and says, you need to provide the funding, they will provide the funding. If the Supreme Court said, you know, we're not going to take it up, meaning to say that the lower court's decision stands, then they will provide that funding. That's the indication that we are getting. They're fighting it, but at the end of the day, if the court said you have to, then you might see a special session for them to actually put that into the budget.
Mary Jo, a prediction on when they'll wrap all this up? Will it be December? Will it be July? Will it be next month?
It's very, very hard to see. No, I don't think it will be December. They're running out of things to do here, which could put some pressure on, let's speed up these negotiations on budget and Medicaid. June, sometime, July 1 is the deadline for having a budget in place.
Luigi, your prediction?
Sometime late May.
Late May. Okay. Luigi Del Puerto, Arizona Capital Times, Mary Jo Pitzel, the Arizona Republic. Thanks for being with me today.
Thank you.
My full interview with Governor's Budget Director John Arnold is on our website, azpm.org, as is a link to the Governor's budget proposal and other information. That's our program for Friday, April 5th, 2013. Next week, we'll sit in on the legislature's economic briefing with a look at the year ahead, and we'll bring that report to you Friday. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Cheeha.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.